If you're someone who plays 5e and you're going to continue playing 5e, should you buy the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide? Yes, the new rules are clearer, better, the layout is vastly improved, but you were probably going to buy it anyway, right? So if you're someone who's already tried D&D 5e and you didn't really like it, and then you went on to play older editions of the game or other role-playing systems, should you buy the 2024 DMG? No, probably not. I don't think anything I would say could change your mind, and honestly I'm not trying to, so you already know enough about your own preferences, so go play Swords and Wizardry, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Labyrinth Lord, Pathfinder, or any of the other hundreds of fantasy RPGs out there. Not to mention the endless options of non-fantasy games like Genesis, Call of Cthulhu, GURPS, Paranoia, Dread, Blades in the Dark, and lots more. I'm sure there are people in the comments ready to tell you all about those other games. But that's beyond the scope of this video. This video is about that new 5e stuff. We're still calling 5e even though it's new 5e, 5.2024. Is that what we're supposed to call it? Okay. So if you're on the fence, and you're looking for more information about what is in this book, then you're in luck. I'm going to talk about just that. Welcome to Mystic Arts, where I, like your dad with a new subwoofer you just bought, will tell you to read the f***ing manual. My name is Daði, I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for over 10 years. I apologize how late this video is coming out. Loads of D&D tubers have already covered this book and gotten their videos out. I didn't get an advanced review copy, though in fairness to WotC, we only just launched this channel a few weeks ago, so it's not like they could have known. So I had to buy this book at my friendly local game store and read it like the rest of the D&D community, and now that I have, I want to talk about it. All of this is to say, this video is not sponsored, these are my own opinions, nobody's bought them, and there are plenty of things I dislike about WotC, Hasbro, and 5e, but this book isn't one of them. I really like this book. The writers and designers deserve some serious praise. They're doing good work. As a terminally online member of the D&D community, I spend a lot of time in various D&D subreddits, and occasionally I see posts that go something like, I think I'm a bad DM. Are there resources online that I can look into to be better? I'll take any suggestions. By the way, I don't read the rules. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point. I cannot believe I have to say this, but you have to read the rules. Tabletop role-playing games don't run on Unreal Engine. They run in your brain. And if your brain doesn't know how the game works, the game's gonna crash. In another video, I said you don't have to read all the books to get started, and I stand by that comment. To start, read the Playing the Game section of the free rules and start playing. It only takes 90 minutes. But if you're already playing, and especially if you're looking to step up your game, start reading the official reference books. They are the manual. Read it. Understanding the rules will make running the game much easier. It will also make it easier to figure out new rulings, since you know where the rules for individual sections are written down so you can quickly look them up. But more than that, reading the books will give you new ideas. Every time I flip through these things, my mind starts racing with inspiration for what to do in my next game. And I am saying that as a 10-year veteran DM who was last inspired by The West Wing.
You are a good man, Josh.
Yes, I really am quite something.
But when I was starting out, I had no idea what kinds of games D&D could create, or what to do with the players once we all got around the table together. If I just read the book, I would have known. Seriously, read the books. You're the game engine. Read the source code.
What's next?
Our point is that it's...
I understood the point, and when I ask what's next, it means I'm ready to move on to other things. So, what's next?
I wanted to start off by saying how good the new layout is. Kudos to the layout team. This is excellent work. Points are usually constricted to a page or a spread. They liberally use small pieces of art in page corners to fill in sections that would have otherwise been the start of a whole other train of thought. Long paragraphs are broken up into subheaders. This makes it easy to skim, easy to look up sections, and especially inviting to read. As someone with a cocktail of neurodivergence in their head, this feels easy to approach. And since I know tons of you out there are just as kooky as I am, this will help you as well. Look at this section about things you need. The header is self-explanatory. First off, great stuff. It uses simple and direct language instead of something like requisite materials for play. Ugh. And below, there's a single sentence. No long-winded lecture. And after that, there's a series of subheaders with short paragraphs underneath. Let's compare this to the first spread in the 2014 DMG, where there's 3 headers about mastering the world, adventure, and rules. Each section is overly explanatory, and good advice is buried within layers of text. Putting aside the daunting language of mastery, it's also daunting to look at. No wonder loads of people never get around to reading this book. Back to the 2024 version, even someone with serious ADHD could quickly skim this section to find the bit they needed by Son. If that person wanted to read every part of this particular spread, or this entire book, their experience would be so much better. They'd find themselves completing lots of little milestones. Read the section on dice. Okay, done. Now the section on note-taking materials. Okay, done. You get little dopamine hits as you go along. I have a friend who struggles with ADHD, but she was so excited to read this book when it came out, she read the whole thing before I even made it out of my apartment to buy it. She tried to read the first DMG back in the day and just couldn't do it. But the new one? No problem. Anyone could read this. I think the font's a bit bigger too. Not a lot, but by like a point or something. It all helps. So what's the fundamental difference between the new DMG and the old DMG? It's ease of access. This new book even has examples of play that were completely missing in the old book. I love examples of play. Let's dive into the opening spread of each book. In the 2024 book, the first spread is one full page art just to ease us in, and then one page of text. That page of text is broken up into an introduction, what does a DM do, a section on DM tips, and a sidebar about what's new in the 2024 book compared to the previous version. This section on DM tips is chock full of sound advice, separated by mini subheaders that summarize each point. Be fair and flexible. It's okay to make mistakes, that kind of stuff. And what does a DM do makes itself approachable by not calling you a master of anything, but rather describing your role with similar jobs. Actor, director, referee, and the introductory text tells you what a DM is, as if you've never heard of it. Check this out. The Dungeon Master's Guide is written for the player who presides over the game and makes sure everyone is having fun. This player is the Dungeon Master, or DM. Being a DM is a fun and empowering and rewarding experience. That's fantastic. And if you never read the 2014 DMG, this approach I just described might seem obvious, but here is how that older book starts. The Dungeon Master's Guide assumes that you know the basics of how to play the D&D tabletop role-playing game. If you haven't played before, the Dungeons & Dragons starter set is a great place to start. And then it has the gall to do this. Look at this mess. It just goes on and on and on about all kinds of things with no apparent structure. It's mostly the same advice as the 2024 book. Some is verbatim, but it is so buried within this wall of text that there is no way for anyone to make sense of it. And by the way, that failure to help new DMs isn't unique to the 2014 DMG. In fact, it's a time-honored tradition. For so much of the game's history, probably until actual play came along, the only way to learn how to DM was to either struggle through the rulebooks yourself or watch other DMs run the game. The 1986 Dungeon Master's Guide, of which I have the 1995 Collector's Edition copy, contains absolutely no description of what a DM even is, not in the foreword or the two separate introduction pages. Instead, the introduction usefully includes this bit of text. There are hundreds of tricks, shortcuts, and simple principles that make you a better, more dramatic, and more creative game master. But you won't find them in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Gee, thanks for telling me that there's information out there. You're just not gonna give it to me? This new book is definitely better for new DMs. Chapter 1, cleverly titled The Basics, actually explains the basics. It assumes you don't know what the DM does. What a novel concept. And it's not like it's weighing down the book for experienced DMs who are going to skip the first chapter anyway. Those DMs are here for the Toolbox, the Bastions, and magic items. Beginner friendliness doesn't matter to them. What comes next is a remarkably reasonable structure compared to the old book. This new DMG structures itself for newbies so that the most simple concepts are at the front, and the book gets progressively more advanced as it goes on. Again, that might not seem that impressive, but let's compare it to the 2014 book, which opens by talking about the multiverse of D&D on page 43 with the title Chapter 2, Creating a Multiverse. Good God. What were they thinking? I mean, I made my own multiverse, campaign setting, the works, but I also know new players who wanted to become DMs. They picked up this book, and then they were absolutely shell-shocked by the responsibilities they felt had been put on them. Once, a player in my group was interested in getting into DMing, so for his birthday, I got him the DMG. I think that was a huge disservice. He did end up running, but my present was harmful more than it was anything else. In the new book, chapter 2 is called Running the Game and contains loads of good advice, enough to make channels like this one obsolete. Subscribe while we're still here. It's even got some prime encouragement that new DMs can do with hearing. There's this art at the start with a picture of Zuctomoy, and it says, like Zuctomoy, the demon queen of fungi cultivates her fungal gardens. You can carefully cultivate a vibrantly growing campaign. Slay. This new book has advice on simple things like group size, absent players, multiple DMs, when and why to roll the dice, how to narrate effectively, improv guidance, miniature and terrain logistics, XP and milestones, and how to avoid combat turning into a slog. There's also advice on some more niche things, like being submerged in lava, hazards like yellow mold or extreme temperatures, spider webs, marks of prestige, mobs, and firearms. Honestly, the DM's Toolbox chapter is a lot of fun, and I'll be going back to it in the future. It's got so much good stuff in it. It's bound to inspire people. It's inspiring me. Oh, and I should mention that unlike the 2014 DMG, this book includes advice on running online games throughout. So if you're someone who plays online, this is a good resource too. Seriously, if you're a new dungeon master, this book is for you. And if you're like me and you're getting closer to those 10,000 hours, you'll still find this really useful. I'm not sponsored, I promise. There's stuff I don't like. Stick around. I'm not going to go through the whole book page by page or anything, but I do want to touch on some of the topics I thought were worth mentioning. There is a section on exploration starting at page 33 that I think will be very useful to help fight against the ongoing consensus that 5e's exploration system leaves a lot to be desired. It includes rules that define journeys as 3 stages and then shows you how to make that interesting. I think it's good stuff. Personally, I don't like the granular yet arbitrary setup that is the trio of fast pace versus slow pace versus normal pace. It never worked on me. It's somehow too granular to be understood at a glance and too arbitrary to really make a meaningful difference. I have my own rules for exploration that I use with hex crawling that I'll stick to, but to each their own. On the DM's Toolbox, I wanted to say that I especially love the section on marks of prestige. It's just one spread, but reading it made me really excited about offering my players a different sort of reward. One rooted in favor, fame, and renown. It wasn't a system, it didn't have renown points. Actually, there is a section on renown points, and I didn't like it that much. It seems like a fair bit of tracking for a whole load of nothing. It could easily be replaced by a bit of skill from the DM just adjudicating things fairly. That section on NPCs is pretty good too, but it contains this weird loyalty score system that just bores me. It invites you to track a loyalty score from 0 to 20, and then add or remove a D4 at certain events. Maybe this is interesting if there's one NPC in the party and the adventure revolves around convincing them or keeping them loyal, but honestly, DMs don't need to track points like that over the course of the adventure. In Baldur's Gate 3, it's good there's a loyalty system since a computer needs to understand those systems, but people understand people. And I doubt they need a system like this to know whether or not an NPC likes them. The DM can just adjudicate it. If the heroes act like monsters, the NPC leaves and plots against them or calls the cops on them. If the players save the NPC or help them with a quest related to them, the NPC is loyal. You don't need a numerical score to figure that out. This section also includes a passage at the end about using loyalty scores for sailing ship crews. That makes way more sense to me. I've done that before and it worked alright. The chase section has been updated, like a little, and it still fails to capture my imagination. It straddles the line between basically a combat, but not really, and some special circumstance rules, like having a limited pool of dashes per character. If we were in combat already and the chase started following combat, did the dashes count the ones before? What if they affected starting positions? It doesn't make much sense to me. I don't know, the whole thing boils down to dash every turn and keep succeeding con saves. It's uninspiring. I'm sure there's a way to make chases properly. 4E skill challenges work better, but I found them to be a bit hit or miss. They're a little too much of a minigame for me sometimes. I don't know what the solution is with chases. I think 5E's a little poorly suited for them, honestly. There was a pretty fun one in Waterdeep Dragon Heist that basically was a whole set piece, so I think that's probably the best way to do these kinds of things. Maybe I'll try some chase variants in my table and see what sticks. There's a couple of pages on how to make settlements that I think is brilliant advice for DMs of all experience levels. I found it insightful. I likely won't roll on the tables much, but knowing which tables they chose to print was an insight in and of itself. For instance, there's a table called Current Calamity, and boy is that cool. Your players come to a town, something should be going on. It doesn't have to be catastrophic, but there's something happening. And that calamity is felt across the entire town. Every interaction is in some way related to it. That way, your settlement is about something. There's a story there. The sections on homebrew is very stripped down compared to the 2014 rules. On creating monsters, for example, there's way less work gone into showing the math, where it comes from and why it is the way it is. The creating a monster section is gone from 10 pages in 2014 down to a measly 2 in the new book. Maybe that's going to be covered by the new monster manual, we just don't know. Similarly, brutal cuts have been applied to the sections on creating spells or magic items. Guidance on design philosophy is nowhere to be found. I really hope that's going to get its own book for DMs with serious guidance on homebrew, but I doubt it. 2014's 5e seemed to be proud of how easy it was to homebrew for. I worry that this new same edition is more of that sort of walled garden approach. I think that's better for new players, but I think it's worse for DMs who are headed into a second or third campaign. There's also a couple of pages about traps, including a load of perfectly good example traps. I think they're really good. Some are magical, some are mundane, all kinds. Each trap is explained thoroughly, and there's text for detecting and disarming them, destroying them, and using them on higher levels. It introduces a whole structure around traps, something 5e always needed, and now it's there. And by existing within a structure, it shows the reader how to make their own traps. And there's even a little bit of guidance on how to do just that. There's a little note about narrative curses in the DM toolbox that I particularly appreciated seeing, just to give DMs permission to create curses that are a part of the story of a game. I know that there are loads of people out there whose issue with 5e is that the system asks too much of the DM and should help DMs with more and more structured setup, and the mechanics like narrative curses feel like salt in the wound for those people. While I understand the sentiment, I also disagree with the core principle of the idea. One of the things I love most about 5e is the flexibility afforded to DMs to choose their style of play. The fact that DMs are, by the rules, explicitly permitted and invited to make their own curses is exactly what I want from a game meant to simulate the world that exists inside the heads of me and my players. My biggest pet peeve with any RPG is when my storytelling is hampered by a system that's too rigorous. I'm a professional storyteller, and before that I was an amateur storyteller, and before that I just really loved stories. I don't want games to lock me in place narratively, and 5e wants to actively get out of my way when it comes to narrative and impose itself when it comes to combat. And that works for me. If that doesn't work for you, then you might want to consider another system. But having tried loads, this system, flawed as it is, usually works just right for me and my group. If you're someone who intends to make their own adventures and campaigns for your players, this book is for you. The 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is all about providing resources to DMs that will explain the secrets of how to Dungeon Master. It is seriously very good, to a degree that is worrying to me, because videos like mine about how to DM are spoiled by the book. How dare they? It's given my secrets away. I thought it was my job! Chapter 4, Creating Adventures, defines an adventure as a story that consists of encounters. This chapter includes the revised CR math. In short, the multipliers for monsters per side is thankfully gone and replaced with some guidance on best practices around the action economy, which is how most people ran the game anyway. And the easy difficulty nobody used is gone, and the 3 other difficulties are now called easy, medium, and hard. Deadly is gone, since it was straight up a misnomer after all. There is advice on variety, urgency, rests, random encounters, on treasure hoards, on rewards in general. There's also some advice on adventure structure, such as including a climax and a resolution. At the end of that chapter, there are a handful of adventure examples, which aren't much good for running right out of the book. You'd have to do a bit to prep and adapt them, but they are great examples of how your own notes for an adventure could look. My notes from my adventures look like that, which I think is healthy for the hobby. Your adventure prep doesn't need to look like this. Chapter 5, Creating Campaigns, defines a campaign as consisting of several adventures connected in some way. Like the adventure section, it's got guidance on structure and storytelling, as well as a bit on the flavors of fantasy: heroic, epic, or mythical fantasy, supernatural horror, sword and sorcery, intrigue, mystery, war, swashbuckling, or crossing the streams like Gamma World or Spelljammer. All of them valid types, and all of them were introduced in 2014, but now there's more actionable advice on how to make those in this campaign book, including more specific hooks. It feels very inclusive of a broad spectrum of adventure, which is great for my game, to be honest. I run countless adventures and campaigns across my campaign setting, set in my world, across its history and massive world map, and all of those types of fantasy exist somewhere in my world. This is kind of the virtue of how broad a game D&D can be. And while there are loads of folks who'd feel better served with a system that hones in on one genre, I want the kitchen sink. I love the idea of my Spelljammer characters helping fight Tiamat with the epic fantasy characters, all of which is a foreboding history to my current intrigue game set a few decades after the last war. I honestly think that's awesome. And I'd have a hard time doing it without a game like 5e, but it could be done. I've played and had fun in other systems, but this really appeals to my style of play. The chapter continues with advice on how to start and communicate genre to your players, something about Session 0, about the options of how parties get created on or off screen. There is some advice in here about running both episodic and serialized campaigns, which I don't think we've had explicitly in the books before, but I love those games. Some of my players have episodic campaigns set in my homebrew world, so once a year or so they run a new episode and we all have fun. It's a great way to play. You can start the episode wherever. Sometimes they start with a new hook, sometimes there are connections, but a lot of the time, we start with a time skip. It's been 3 years since the 4 of you were in the same room. That's so different, and it can be so much fun. It also includes this bit of advice. It's easy to get caught up in a story with dramatic stakes, pitting characters against mounting threats, but every so often, at least once every 3 to 5 levels, give the characters a break. A low-stakes session or adventure that has nothing to do with the overarching plot or broader perils. I should do that more. At least I should try to. My games tend to all be high tension all the time. I think that's the most common bit of feedback I get from my players. It's some variation of when we get a beach episode. Soon, I promise. In the book, there is what the marketing people have called a truncated campaign setting, but I was surprised by how much there is. It's 30 pages, and certainly an easy thing for an interested DM to take and make their own. Or at the very least, read through and get an idea of how to make their own world. It includes a decently healthy gazetteer, but more importantly, there's this section on how to structure adventures around 3 main conflicts. The dragons, the elementals, and I use the evil. I think that's the most useful part in there. Notice how the campaign setting isn't defined as a standalone unit. It is nothing without the story it's telling. The first thing the book says about Greyhawk is who the bad guys are and how to structure an adventure around them. I think that's a really important point. Your campaign setting isn't complete until you've populated it with at least 3 bad guys that create stories for you to tell in that setting. Stories come from conflict, so your world is just a stagnant map until you've given it something to fight about. There's also a chapter in here about the D&D Cosmology. I won't go into detail simply because there is a lot of nerd lore for nerds, and I'm a nerd and I like it, but if you use your own cosmology, then you're probably not interested. And if you use the D&D Cosmology, then this is more of that. I didn't find anything obviously missing. It looks like a lot of stuff is reprinted. Though they did add a section on what an adventure in each plane could be about. Each section is around 100 words, not enough to run with, but enough to be inspired by. I do like that Sigil now plays a huge role in the multiverse again. It seems to have gotten beefed up since the 2014 version. So I've said a lot about this book without really mentioning the actual selling point. This book is full of magic items. It is the largest chapter by far. The treasures section takes up 120 pages out of this 384 total pages in this book. Broadly speaking, the magic items presented are good. All the changes seem to focus mostly on making the magic items approachable for more styles of play, moving items into a fairly standardized direction, making sure to say whether an item is a magic action or a utilize action, for example, in accordance with a new language in the player's handbook. It's all incredibly inoffensive. Which means I'll probably use more of these items in the future, even though I always end up tweaking something. The downside of the inoffensive nature of this revised magic item list is that some of the weird bits are gone, and I often like those weird bits. My group and I like finding excuses to tie them into our stories, give them the spotlight and let them inspire us. Magnus, a player in my group, ran a standalone adventure for us where a dwarf, played by one of the player characters, led the party to go find the axe of the Dwarfish Lords buried deep within the mountains. Only the dwarf was trying to make sure we didn't find the axe. This was the Earthheart Forge, and the dwarf had put the axe there himself almost 50 years ago. And this expedition we were on was destined to find it. And if we did, we would remove it from the Earthheart Forge, and the axe wouldn't be destroyed, because the magic item says it must remain within the forge for 50 years. So this dwarf wanted to sabotage the whole mission, because we were going to look for it anyway. So why did the dwarf want to destroy the axe of the Dwarfish Lords? Because he wasn't a dwarf. He was an elf. He hated the dwarves and the axe, because the axe had cursed him to look like a dwarf, because that's what the axe of the Dwarfish Lords does. Only, in the new version of the rules, it doesn't do that anymore. So, in my world, I'll keep using the older, more weird rules, and I suspect that'll be true for some of the other more weird magic items in the book. I miss a lot of the weirder stuff, but nobody's sending the Pinkertons to take the 2014 book from me, so I'll get to keep it just how I like it. Plus, I have the 2nd edition Book of Artifacts, which I'll happily continue to steal for weird things, like the AD&D version of the Axe of the Dwarfish Lords, or the Book with No End. The new rules contain guidance on how often to give out magic items, which I think is a good thing. I will be consulting that table for my ongoing campaign. The random treasure table is shorter, and probably better. It goes by theme and rarity, instead of sorting itself into what always seemed like arbitrary columns. And back then, Table A used to mostly just say, give your players a healing potion. Gee, thanks. Good table. The last chapter in the book is about Bastions, basically the party's home base, if you allow it. The idea is that the players build rooms that grant them some defined ability, and then they can make more rooms as they level up. Basically like feats that are hyper-specific and only work for 7 days after you were last in your home base. I think it's neat. I might incorporate it into my own home game, maybe. I think there's a lot of special rooms in here, and I'd want my rules lawyer players to inspect the list thoroughly first, just to help me spot exploits I might have missed, but they all seem fun. I love stuff like this. My long-term games are all about that style of play where the players have a home base, fortification, they go on to become kings and queens. My main campaign is called Kingmaker, named after the Pathfinder adventure path, although it never had much in common with it other than the fact that we were using the Kingdom's rule set back when we were playing Pathfinder. Today, in our 3rd Kingmaker campaign, we use our own homebrew rules for running domains, and they're granular and complicated. Something that would make for a terrible RPG product. It's so bad, but we love it. It's for us. It requires spreadsheets and loads of math. My players worry about global trade, road construction, and things of that nature. So oddly enough, for me, the Bastions are just a little too simple, which is probably a good thing. My version is pretty terrible. What's especially good about the Bastion rules is that they reference other rules in the game. It's not a completely separate system. It uses supernatural gifts, magic items, and specific crafting rules, all good things. I think the main reason Bastions are in this book, however, is to appeal to veteran DMs who weren't interested in revisions, but could be swayed to buy this book for the Bastion rules alone. How you feel about that is up to you. I can't fault them too much, since I imagine an official sourcebook on the subject might not sell well. Then again, Strongholds and Followers and Kingdoms and Warfare both did all right for MCDM. I bought both books and I've used them a fair bit. I think Bastions are a better design than Strongholds, and I don't think it's even close. The Bastions are better balanced, better designed, and honestly more appealing overall. However, I think the purpose of these rules is to eventually engage in mass combat, which is missing from the Bastion rules entirely. I've used the Kingdoms and Warfare rules for mass combat several times, and they're pretty good. I made some alterations to them over the years, and now I run my own version of those rules. I'll make a video about that eventually. The first appendix in the Dungeon Master's Guide is called the Lore Glossary, and I think it's a good addition. I had fun reading it. I don't think there's much to say about it, except that it's there, and new DMs might find it fascinating. I certainly would have loved to see it when I was starting out. Oh, and the second appendix is great. It's a bunch of example maps, and yeah, the old books had them too, but these are so much more useful to new DMs. They have diagrams of what places look like at a side angle to show you how the dungeon levels connect, and they're all in black and white, so they're very legible. I think they're brilliant, and I'm going to use all of them for my ongoing sandboxy hexcrawl game. D&D's new Old Edition is a lot like the old New Edition. They're both called 5e, they're both proudly sporting subclasses, feats every 4th level, bounded accuracy, and all the other major changes from previous editions. The 2024 version of the rules seems to me to be largely a reorganization effort to make rules' intentions clearer, fix some of what the designers viewed as the major issues with the game balance from 2014, and primarily to write rulebooks that were welcoming to a larger audience. When they wrote the 2014 books, they were writing rulebooks for a legacy game that had lost a large chunk of its audience. The balance assumed you were crawling through dungeons, with the major playtest adventure being a 100-room dungeon called Dead and Thay. That's how 5e was designed. That is not the 5th edition that exists today. Compared to today, those designers back in 2014 had less money, less time, and no idea where the game was going. They didn't know Stranger Things, Critical Role, and D&D 2 was about to happen. They didn't know about the pandemic, about the huge boost in online play, or the shift in the cultural zeitgeist towards nerddom with Marvel movies. They didn't know about Baldur's Gate 3 or Honor Among Thieves. They couldn't have written the edition of the rules we ended up playing. How could they have known? If I were on that design team, I really would have wanted another swing at these core books, and making those books for an audience that was reading them. I would have been desperate to reorganize the Dungeon Master's Guide in the way that they did, and I think they've done a brilliant job of it. I really do. I was really pleased with my purchase of the book, really pleased with the new direction the game seems to be headed in, and optimistic about adventures published in this style. Not with these rules necessarily, though I've got nothing against them per se, but with adventures written with the ease of access and clarity that permeates these new books. That's appealing to me. I really hope they keep that tone moving forward. Professor Dungeon Master said this is the best Dungeon Master's Guide ever designed for official Dungeons & Dragons, and I agree. I think this is the best Dungeon Master's Guide I've read cover to cover. Or maybe not. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching this video. Me and my girlfriend make these videos together as partners, both writing and editing. We asked about a Discord in a recent video. We're looking into that and we're trying to figure out exactly how we want to do it, so stay tuned on that. So other than that, if you like this video, then consider liking, commenting, and subscribing and hitting the bell if you want to be notified when we release new videos. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.